So welcome. I'll give a quick intro to me and to Crayon, but we'll spend the bulk of the time on parental leave. And I've left about 10 minutes at the end to answer any questions you have. And if there's anything we don't cover, feel free to send me an email afterwards. I'd be more than happy to answer. And we also have a Q&A box, so feel free to pop questions in there as we go. So Crayon really started because of these two. They're using my daughters, Madeline and Louisa. I had Louisa 4 years ago, and even though I had worked in finance and studied finance, I still found that there were a lot of financial puzzles that are unique to parenthood that no one really tells you about or gives you any guidance on. So that's really why I started Crayon. And our mission is to reduce financial stress for parents. For a lot of people, the rubber really hits the road when it comes to parental leave. And that's why we've built the register and why we're running today's session. And really, what we'll be going through is a quick overview of the key terms in the legislation, what you can get financially from the government, what your rights and responsibilities are, how you can get the most out of parental leave, and then we're going to go through a few common scenarios, or a few scenarios, I should say, that some parents may find themselves in, ranging from, what if I want to go back to work earlier, or what if I want to extend parental leave, all the way through to potentially unfortunate situations, such as what if I have a miscarriage or a loss of child. So that's actually the first question we cover in that what if section. So just giving a little trigger warning there. I think for me personally with parental leave, I didn't know much about it before I became pregnant. I think perhaps like a lot of people, I looked into it quite late into the game. And I had actually been recruited for a role at a different company not long before I fell pregnant with my first daughter, Louisa. And I didn't know the rules at the time, but had I taken that role, I actually wouldn't have been eligible or entitled to 12 months of parental leave under the law. I could have negotiated it, but I would have been on the back foot. And I was lucky I didn't get caught out. I didn't take that role for different reasons. But it is something to be aware of, particularly if you're planning to have kids or you're planning to change jobs. So in New Zealand, the law that governs parental leave is the Parental Leave Employment Protection Act, or otherwise known as PLEPA. And it covers two key scenarios, and the rules are largely the same, and I'll call it out where it's not. But the same rules apply to whether you're welcoming a child by birth or whether you're taking permanent responsibility for a child under the age of 6. So that could be through adoption, surrogacy, permanent care, through Oranga Tamariki, are a couple of examples. So there are two key roles as defined by the legislation. So this is not my personal view of where I think a parent or a label should be applied, but this is how the law sees it. So primary carer, by definition, if you are the biological mother, then you are or the birth parent, you are the primary carer by default. That's how the law sees it. You can transfer some or all of your entitlement to your spouse or partner, at which point they become the primary carer. And then the third scenario is if you're taking permanent responsibility for a child under the age of 6, you are the primary carer, or you can nominate. So as a couple, you can decide which one of you is the primary carer. The second term under the legislation, or the role that's defined, is partner. This one's pretty straightforward. You are a partner if you're the spouse or partner of someone who meets a legal definition of a primary carer. So they're kind of the key roles that we'll cover in this presentation. So then we come to the financial part. The main source of financial support is parental leave payments. So the most you can get is 26 weeks, and the government matches your income dollar for dollar up until a cap of $661.12 per week, and that's before tax. So the maximum that you can get is just over $17,000. There are a few key criteria that apply. We have a tool on our website that's like a quiz that guides you through it, so feel free to have a play with that afterwards. But the main qualifying criteria to highlight is that you need to have worked for any of the 26 weeks in the 52 weeks for an average of at least 10 hours per week prior to your child's arrival. So you can qualify as either a self-employed person or you can qualify as an employee. You can't combine your self-employment with your employee status to make those to make that criteria, but you can qualify as either self-employed or as an employee. If you're an employee, you can qualify by combining multiple employers. So it might be that you change jobs, but you still work for at least 26 weeks. Or it could be that you juggle multiple jobs at once to make that 10-hour requirement. It's worth noting that it doesn't need to be for the same employer. And then lastly, you can transfer this entitlement. It's a one-time, one-way transfer. So what I mean by that is parental leave payments, they have to be taken in a 26-week block, one block. You can't split it up over the year. It's got to be at once. And the payments are made fortnightly by the IRD. You can transfer it to your partner. So let's, for example, say you take the first 20 weeks and then you transfer that entitlement to your partner for the last 6 weeks or vice versa. So that's how it works, but you can only transfer it once and they can't transfer it back to you. So in case you're wondering where New Zealand sits relative to the rest of the world, this is OECD countries, so developed nations, and it looks at what they call full rate equivalent. So in New Zealand, we pay parental leave at just below minimum wage. So if you look at the average wage of what someone earns in each of these countries, we pay the equivalent of about 13 weeks for the average Kiwi. That puts us in the bottom quartile amongst developed countries, where the average is about 31 weeks. We have no paid partner leave that's specifically reserved. And so that puts us dead last with Israel and the USA on a global basis. I do note here that the language is gendered. That's because that's what OECD has used for the purpose of this research. So what that means is that 71% of expecting parents feel financially stressed. So if you feel this way, know that at least that you're not alone. In fact, the majority of people feel this way. 70% of Kiwi mums take less parental leave than they want to take. And a big driver of that is financial constraints. They simply can't afford to spend as much time with their family as they would like. And we'll get into what partners can get, but 4% of dads take unpaid partner leave. Now, they do sometimes take other time, like annual leave, etc. And again, we'll cover that. But in terms of what's allocated to them under the legislation, only 4% of that is used. And again, it's because, if you think about it, if the primary carer is getting $661.12 and the partner's getting nothing, that doesn't really take you very far, especially in today's environment. So that just gives you a bit of context about where we sit globally and the impact of the policy that we have. So the other thing to note is KiwiSaver. So while you're working, you can make employee contributions. The default rate is 3%. If you contribute, then your employer can contribute, again, at a minimum of 3%. So if you took someone on median income and they took 12 months of parental leave, you can see that the impact here is just shy of $3,000 in missed contributions. Fast forward 30 years to your retirement, even in a balance fund, which could be worth around $8,000 at retirement. So when you take parental leave, by default, KiwiSaver does not come out of your government paid parental leave. You can elect to do so. So there's a box you can essentially tick when you're applying that says, please deduct KiwiSaver. But even then, because most people earn more than the minimum wage, then you'll be missing out on what you would have been getting. So it's just something to flag because I think it's a hidden cost a lot of us don't think about. I didn't think about when I went on parental leave. So it's perhaps a conversation to have ahead of time, or perhaps something you want to contribute more towards while you are working, either before parental leave or after parental leave. We have a calculator. It's a free downloadable one on our website where you can kind of plug in the numbers to see how much you're going to miss out on. And then you can kind of see how much you'd need to increase your KiwiSaver rate for how long to catch up. So it's just another cost to be aware of. So other sources of financial support, there are really two from the government. The first is the Working for Families tax credit. The main one to call out here is Best Start. So it's $69 per week per child for the first year, and you get that regardless of how much your family earns. It starts after your government paid parental leave finishes. You can get Best Start in your child's second and third year, but it becomes based on family income. And there are 3 other tax credits available, again, based on your family income. They've got a calculator on their website. You can kind of answer the questions to see what you might be eligible for. And then WINS also offers benefits. Again, they're all means tested. So they're all based on how much your family earns. And sometimes there are asset tests. So they'll test how much you own, not just how much income you're generating. There are a variety of benefits from childcare subsidies. They can help out with one-off costs like a bassinet or car seats, living expenses. If you're a solo parent, a young parent, if you have more than one child at once, they do have support available. But again, different rules apply to each benefit. So it is a type of thing you probably want to book an appointment or at least do the quiz online to see if you're eligible for. They do have a tool on their website. It's worth noting for both of these that you might be eligible for a period of time. So say after your government paid parental leave stops and you're relying potentially on just one income, you might be eligible for one or both of these sources of financial support. But when you go back to work, or if you go back to work and you start earning again, please notify them, because what can happen is if you don't tell them that your family income has gone up and they keep paying you these financial benefits, if you're no longer eligible for them, what you'll end up facing is a tax bill come end of March the next year. So as your family income changes, just be sure to keep in contact with them and let them know. So that's what's available to Kiwi parents in New Zealand, at least from a financial perspective. The next part of this presentation really covers rights and responsibilities, particularly for employees. If you're a self-employed person, your main right is to the money, to the parental leave payment. Because you are your own boss, you can dictate obviously how much time you take off and leave that you need to take, etc. I will note that while you're receiving government payments as a self-employed person, you're not meant to be working. You are meant to be spending time with your child as far as the law is concerned. So you can do a bit of admin and oversight, but if they see that you're working and generating revenue, etc., they will stop your government paid parental leave. You're meant to be off as an employee would be off. So that's your kind of main right and responsibility. If you're an employee, there are quite a few that you want to be aware of. The first bucket is when you're expecting. So I've had colleagues tell me they're pregnant at 6 weeks. They're just so excited. I've also seen colleagues try and hide their pregnancy all the way to 6 months because they didn't want to jeopardize a bonus and a promotion. So where you sit on that spectrum is a very personal choice, but legally you need to give notice to your employer if you're giving birth at least 3 months before your due date. And if you're taking permanent responsibility, then at least 14 days before you take, that child arrives in your care. There are very specific things that you need to cover off, and Employment New Zealand has templates on their website with, essentially what you need to say in writing to your employer. Now, obviously, you can discuss it with them ahead of time and make plans, but this is legally the minimum amount of notice that you need to give. If you're pregnant, you are entitled to 10 days of special unpaid leave for your pregnancy. So that's to attend scans, antenatal class, midwife or OB appointments. I think for a lot of people, especially with flexible working now, you may want to see if you can just take those appointments without having to take unpaid leave. Some employers, and we see it on the register, a lot of them are open to people taking their appointments as needed and then doing their work as required. So again, a conversation to have with your manager, but know that you're at least entitled to 10 days of unpaid leave. And then the last one is a right to a safe job. So it could be that your pregnancy physically limits your ability to do your role. In the first instance, your employer needs to look to transfer you to alternative duties and keep you in employment and keep you paid. So that might be a different job or slightly different duties or modified duties. If that's not possible, your employer can actually require you to start your parental leave early. If that is the case, you do have extra rights. So for example, you are entitled to at least 20 weeks of primary care leave after your child arrives, even if you have to take, say, 10 weeks of leave beforehand. So you might actually end up with more leave. Now, a lot of that is that's unpaid, but you are entitled to that time with your child after they arrive. So if you find yourself in that situation, drop us a note and we can look into it for you, or contact Employment New Zealand, because it is a bit of a tricky situation. Okay, there are 3 types of leave that you can take to really be with your child. The first is primary care leave. So if you meet the definition of a primary carer that we discussed earlier, then you could be eligible for for 6 months of leave that needs to be taken in one block. The main qualifying criteria is that you need to have worked for the same employer for at least an average of 10 hours per week in the 6 months right before your child arrives. So unlike the payments where you can qualify by working for different employers, this one you really need to be at the same employer for a minimum of 6 months. The second type of leave is extended leave. Now, both parents can share this if they meet the criteria, and there's more flexibility in terms of how you use it. And I'll run through some scenarios in a couple of slides to give you a few ideas. The main qualifying criteria is 6 months at the same employer for 6 months of extended leave, and 12 months for 12 months of extended leave. It's worth noting that extended leave includes any primary care leave that you take. So if you've been at the same employer for only 6 months, you'll be entitled to 6 months of primary care leave and 6 months of extended leave, but that's combined. So the most you can take is 6 months. And similarly, if you've been an employer for 12 months or more, the most you can get is 12 months of leave. The next leave is partner leave. So if you meet the legal definition of a partner, if you've been at the same employer for a minimum of 6 months, you get 1 week of partner leave that's unpaid. And if you've been at the same employer for 12 months, you get 2 weeks of unpaid partner leave. The window to take this is a lot narrower. The earliest you can start it is 21 days before your child's expected arrival date, and it needs to finish 21 days after your child has actually arrived. If your child needs to stay in hospital for longer than that, it is possible to extend that window until the day your child's discharged, but your entitlement still remains either 1 week or 2 weeks. So let's look at a couple of scenarios. This is Maya. She's been working full-time for years, but she switched jobs while she was pregnant. So it means that by the time her baby due date comes around, she's been at the same employer for 5 months. So she's actually entitled to the payments, but she's not entitled to any primary care leave or extended leave because she hasn't been there 6 months. In this case, she has to take negotiated care leave. So as the name would suggest, you need to negotiate it with your employer. And legally, there are a list of reasons that they can decline that leave. We don't hear about it very much, which would suggest to me it doesn't happen often that it's declined, but that is the position that you're in. So if you're pregnant and thinking about switching jobs, front foot that conversation with your employer about what that leave would look like, and ideally get it in writing that you'll be able to take that leave when the time comes. The next scenario is a couple, Ruben and Josie. They've been together for a long time. They've both been working for full time for more than 12 months. So they both get 12 months of parental leave, and they want to take some of that leave together. So let's look at how they can do that. So let's say in the first example, they want to take a lot of that time at the same time. So Josie takes 26 weeks of primary care leave. She starts 2 weeks before her due date because she wants to put her feet up for a little bit right before the baby comes. And then Ruben takes 2 weeks of partner leave when the baby arrives, and then 26 weeks of extended leave. So they have a little bit at the end where Josie's gone back to work and he's got their child. So that's how you could play it if you wanted to spend a lot of time together. The second example is if you wanted to tag team. So let's say Josie takes her 26 weeks of primary care leave and then another 2 weeks of extended leave, so she gets 6 months with her child after they're due. Ruben takes 2 weeks around the time the child's due to help out. And then when Josie goes back to work, Ruben can take extended leave. So between them, they can almost get a year with their child. And then the last scenario is, let's say Josie wants to take most of the leave and spend almost a year with their child. Ruben can take 2 weeks of partner leave around the time that the child's due. So that kind of gives you a sense of how that leave can be used. Extended leave, you can go back to work after your primary care leave or partner leave and take extended leave again. It is possible to take extended leave in different chunks or blocks, but you have to agree on that with your employer. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might want to structure your leave. So you're probably thinking either I want to take more time than what's allocated to me, or I want potentially a bit more financial support than what I can get from the government. So these are a couple of ways to think about it. The first is we've launched the register. We are seeing more and more employers offer parental leave benefits. We're probably talking to at least half a dozen or probably a dozen or 2 dozen employers who are working on their policy and rolling out new benefits. So I think it is an area where we're seeing movement across the market. Have a look at the register to see what your current employer offers. If they're not on there, nominate them and we'll ask them to join. We ask about paid leave, KiwiSaver, flexibility, return to work plans. A lot of the time, employers will have terms and conditions to access their policy. So you might need to meet certain conditions to access the government benefits, but you might also need to meet additional criteria. So, for example, we see some employer policies that offer paid benefits, but only if you've been with them for 2 years or more. So it's really worth knowing what those criteria are to make sure that you can be eligible. The second is we see a lot of parents using paid leave to kind of extend the time that they get money. That might be annual leave, time in lieu, long service leave. It's worth flagging annual leave here. There's a special carve out in the legislation that basically says if you take annual leave after you've returned to work and that annual leave you became entitled to while on parental leave or in the 12 months after you return from parental leave, it is paid at your average weekly wage only. So I'll give you a really extreme scenario just so you understand how it works. And we have an article on this on our website. So if you, let's say you take 12 months of parental leave and your employer and you get the government entitlements only, your employer's not giving you anything extra, your average weekly wage over that 12 months is zero, right? You haven't earned anything from your employer. Let's say you needed to take annual leave really soon after coming back to work for whatever reason. That annual leave will be paid at your average weekly wage, which will be close to zero. So obviously, the longer you've been back at work, that average goes up. But for a period of time, that it can be quite low. And I've certainly spoken to a number of parents who take a bit of annual leave and then get a bit of a shock that their paycheck is a lot lower than what they're used to. So that's why we see some employees choosing to use annual leave before they start parental leave. Thankfully, there was a change in the legislation a couple of years ago where you can take any paid leave and then start your parental leave, even if that's after your child has arrived. It used to be that you had to start your parental leave as soon as your child arrived. That's not the case anymore. So you can use up your paid leave first. It's also worth noting that there is legislation pending that would remove this clause, that would remove the devaluing of your annual leave. But it's been pending for 2 years. We don't know when it's going to be passed. It's part of a much bigger package. So hopefully it will change. But at this stage, this is still the law. The last one is keeping in touch hours. So I didn't know about this when I had my first child, but it turns out you can work 64 paid keeping in touch hours while you're receiving government payments. You have to agree to do it. Your employer cannot force you, but your employer also has to agree for you to do it. You can't make them let you work. So it can't be within the first 28 days of birth. I think that's designed to protect people from being asked to work. And if you do more than 64 hours, the government considers you to have returned to work. So your parental leave payments will stop. So if you're getting towards that 60-hour mark, you probably want to keep a pretty close eye on it. It can be pretty handy. 64 hours is 8 working days or almost 2 weeks of pay. And it's worth noting you can use this to attend a meeting with your manager, to come in for a team day, to do training and development, to attend a change announcement. So you can get paid to do those things. It doesn't have to be for your day-to-day job. So there are some ways you can kind of make your dollar stretch a bit further or get a few more dollars in the door. So now we run through a few scenarios, and the first one is around loss of child. So just giving you a heads up. So if you lose a child before 20 weeks, that is defined as a miscarriage. You can access up to 3 days of paid bereavement leave if you've worked for the same employer for 6 months or more. If you have a stillbirth, which is a child, you lose a child after 20 weeks, or you lose an infant child, you can still receive your government paid parental leave and take that time to recover. Obviously, very difficult circumstances to be in. And we do see a lot of employers say that, they are open to discussions about additional paid or unpaid leave to support employees. But I just want to highlight what your legal entitlements are so that you know what your rights are. What if your baby arrives early? So 1 in 10 babies are premature in New Zealand, and that by a medical definition is before 37 weeks of gestation. So you can apply for up to 13 weeks of continuous preterm baby payments if you are eligible for paid parental leave from the government. It's paid at the same rate, so a maximum of $661.12. And you can also work extra keeping in touch hours. So it's your maximum is 3 hours multiplied by the number of weeks that you receive preterm payments. So let's say your baby arrives at 30 weeks, you can get 7 weeks of preterm payments, and you can work up to 21 hours of kit hours. Now, those 21 hours can be worked as you and your employer agree to. So you could do those 21 hours 3 days in a row. You could do it sprinkled over that 7 weeks, or obviously don't need to do all the 21 either. You could do none, but just letting you know that that's kind of your entitlement under the law. You could take preterm payments. It has to be taken in one continuous block, but you could stop. You could go back to work, so even on a part-time basis, and then you could start your paid parental leave as you would. Now, you need to start that paid parental leave before or on the due date of your child. If it's after, you are no longer eligible. So make sure that you're in that situation, you keep those dates in mind. What if you want to go back early for whatever reason? Now, you can usually only go back early if your employer agrees. You need to put it in writing at least 21 days before the date you want to return. Obviously, you might have a conversation with them beforehand, etc., but you do legally need to put it in writing. There are a couple of exceptions to this. You can go back without your employer's agreement if you are no longer the primary carer of the child, if you have a stillbirth or loss of infant. In those situations, you have a right to return to work early. What if you want to go back just as planned? Well, you still need to put it in writing at least 21 days before your parental leave is due to end. Now, again, you might be in conversation with your employer before then, but legally, this is what you need to do. Employment New Zealand has templates for all of these. What if your job isn't held open? So legally, there's a presumption that you can return to the role you were in before you went on parental leave, except for 2 scenarios. One is you occupy a key position, and the second is if you're made redundant. I'll cover that on the next slide. So if you have a key position, and it's quite a high threshold, it might be that you have specialist skills, or, you're in the C-suite or something like that, your role can be filled permanently. If this is the case, you have a 6-month period of preference of reemployment. What that means is that if another role comes up at your organization that is substantially similar to the one you held before you went on parental leave, you have a preference of appointment. So it's worth knowing this. I think a lot of the times when people find themselves in this position, they think, well, I have to go find a job. There's no, but do know that you have this legal preference. And you may want to run down that full 6 months It can be good to do that rather than just resign, because it gives you the option over those 6 months. And if you do take another role with the same employer, you will have had continuous employment. Whereas if you resign, then you won't necessarily have had continuous employment. What if you're made redundant? This is a really sucky situation. And I know with a lot of redundancies happening at the moment, you do hear stories about parents on parental leave being made redundant. The first thing to know is that your employer has to meet all the usual requirements. It needs to be a fair process. It needs to be a genuine redundancy. They need to consult you and take your feedback into account. That all needs to still happen. And again, you can use your keeping in touch hours to get paid for those meetings. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In addition, your employer has to prove that the redundancy or the reason for it occurred after parental leave started, and also that there's no prospect of appointing you to a substantially similar position. So there is a slightly higher bar if you are on parental leave. What if you don't want to return? Sometimes it's hard to know what you'll want when you have your child. If this is the case, you need to let your employer know in writing, either 21 days before parental leave ends, or if your employment contract stipulates a longer notice period, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, you've got to give them that notice period. So just be aware of what your notice period is if you don't intend on going back. You can still get your government payments if you resign. And in terms of paying out your holiday pay, the law looks at it as your last day at work was the start of your parental leave. So in terms of calculating what you're owed in annual leave and holiday pay, that's where that date is taken from. If you feel like you've been unfairly treated, there are very clear timelines by which you need to raise a complaint. And you need to do it before the latest of 6 months from the date that the complaint happened, 6 months from when your child arrives, or 8 weeks after the end of your parental leave. So that's what the employment law stipulates. Your options are to raise it with your employer first. It might be with your manager, their manager, HR. Ideally, you can try and resolve it amicably. If you're having more issues or you want a second opinion, you can engage your union rep if you have one, an agent, an employment lawyer, and you can take it to the Employment Relations Authority, and they will mediate for you. So that's the end of kind of what if scenarios. The last thing I want to cover off before we open up for Q&A is that we have a baby prep course. This kicks off in 2 weeks. We go through a lot of the stuff, but in a lot more detail. So you and your partner, if you have one and they wish to join, we have a 6-week program. We have weekly live sessions, fortnightly sessions with me, and we'll work side by side to answer really key questions for you, like how will your family income actually change? Like be able to see a graph of when it's going to dip and, total, how much are you going to be down? How can you optimize your parental leave? What are all the ways, taking into consideration the government rules and your employer's rules? Kind of how can you jigsaw puzzle the best parental leave arrangement for your family? How much is a baby going to cost you for the choices that you want to make? So the average cost of a baby ranges between $8,000 to $20,000 in that first year, although it's quite a wide range, and a lot of it depends on the parenting choices you make. And so we have a model and a tool that we've built that steps you through that. What can you put in place to kind of help you keep on track with what's important for you financially as a family? And then starting to think about some of the long-term things. So it can be really easy to get, when you're in the day-to-day of working and then parenting, to not kind of stick your head up and look at, okay, well, where are we going long-term and what do we need to do to get there? And we provide, we look at investing, personal insurance, and estate planning to do that. So I want to be clear that it's a financial education course. We're not giving financial advice. There are very clear laws around that. But we give you all the tools and visibility and clarity that you need to make really great decisions for your family. The course is $249 for both you and your partner, and you can find more details and sign up on our website. So with that, I want to open up for Q&A.